Good evening. Tonight we step quietly onto a creaking wooden deck somewhere in the warm waters of the Caribbean, on a night when no cannon fire splits the air and no prize ship sails on the horizon, only the long, uneasy quiet between raids. Lanterns swing low, the sea breathes around you in slow, dark waves, and the smell of tar, sweat, and worn wood wraps itself around your senses like a rough blanket. You probably won't survive this voyage without feeling that strange mix of freedom and dread settle into your bones at least once, the way it did for so many sailors during the so-called Golden Age of Piracy in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, let me know your location and local time down in the comments, so I know where in the world you're listening from as this old ship rocks you towards sleep. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand near the rail, hands resting on salt-stiff rope, and the first thing you notice is not the thrill of adventure, but the hush of a ship with no enemy in sight. The black flag is folded away. There is no point in raising it when there is nothing to chase. Above you, stars spill across the sky like scattered silver, and below them, the deck is crowded with sleeping men in ragged shirts and short jackets, curled against the planks wherever they could find a patch of space. This is not the storm of boarding and cannon fire sung about in ballads. This is the long, slow part of a pirate's life, drifting somewhere between Port Royal and the Windward Passage, between Nassau and the soft outline of Spanish America. You step around a coil of rope and a snoring body, moving toward the mainmast. A few men are awake, speaking in low voices that barely rise above the creak of timber. One leans against a cannon, tapping its iron barrel with his knuckles as if to reassure himself it is still there. Another sits cross-legged, shaving a scrap of wood into a tiny charm. In the lamplight, you see the mix of faces common to these ships in the late 1600s and early 1700s. English and Welsh, Irish, a few French and Dutch, an African sailor carrying old scars from a navy punishment, a man who slips into Spanish when he forgets himself. Most of them did not begin as pirates. Their hands move with the practiced economy of men who have hauled rope and trimmed sail for years on merchantmen or men of war. The so-called Golden Age of Piracy grows in the cracks left by war and trade. When conflicts between European powers ease, privateers who once carried legal letters of marque against enemy nations find their papers suddenly worthless. Some accept low wages again under strict naval discipline. Others, especially in places like Jamaica and the Bahamas, simply keep attacking ships under a different flag. Some historians argue that these crews are desperate workers rebelling against cruel captains and unfair pay. Others see only opportunistic thieves taking what they can from a violent Atlantic world. Standing on this deck, hearing the quiet breathing around you, you sense that both readings touch part of the truth. The hull rolls gently, and you shift your weight, feeling how this whole wooden world, as later writers would call it, never quite rests. Even on a calm night like this, something is always in motion. The slow rise and fall of the deck, the whisper of water along the planks, the faint thrum of wind in the rigging. From the forecastle comes a cough, then a muttered oath. Somewhere aft, a man turns over and sighs. Far ahead, the horizon is only a dark line, the invisible sea roads that carry sugar from Caribbean plantations, silver from Spanish America, and tobacco from English colonies toward distant European ports. You glance toward the quarterdeck, where the watch paces in a steady line. Unlike a king's ship, rank here is rougher, more dependent on reputation than on birth or commission. On many pirate vessels, the captain rules in battle, but shares power in calmer weather. Between raids, the quartermaster speaks for the crew, and big decisions where to sail next, whether to chase a distant sail, how to divide the last prize, are argued out in noisy assemblies. Written articles, agreed to by all, promise shares of plunder, punish theft among shipmates, and even set fixed sums for lost limbs or ruined eyes. Surviving accounts and trial records suggest these codes were not just legend, but fragile attempts to bring order and a kind of harsh fairness to a life surrounded by risk. You draw in, a slow breath. The air is thick with salt and old wood, but also with the human closeness of dozens of bodies crammed into a space never meant for comfort. This deck is only the exposed skin of the ship. Below, in dim hold and low-roofed spaces, hammocks sway in tight rows when there is room for them at all. Barrels and chests crowd the passageways. Rats and insects skitter in the shadows. Later stories will paint piracy as endless horizons and easy freedom. But from here, you can feel how narrow this freedom truly is, fenced by planks, rope, and the smell of other people's sweat. From near the galley, a faint laugh drifts across the deck as a couple of men share a joke about a failed attempt at a prize off Jamaica under a captain they now curse by name. Stories like this circle the ship, passed from mouth to mouth whenever the work eases. Pirates later questioned in courts talk at length about their own daring and their captain's cruelty, and historians still debate how much of those tales is accurate memory and how much careful self-defense in front of hanging judges. Out here, under the stars, the exact border between truth and boasting matters less than the warmth of shared amusement and the way a familiar story keeps the dark from feeling too large. You walk toward the bow, feeling the ship cut through the black water. No land breaks the horizon, but you know it is there. The low islands of the Bahamas, the larger shapes of Jamaica and Hispaniola, the American coastline with its growing ports and plantations. Somewhere beyond sight, traders follow routes that link Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a harsh web of goods and forced labor. This quiet night between raids floats on that wider world, on sugar cut by enslaved hands, silver dug from distant mountains, tobacco tied in bales in colonial warehouses. Your ship is only a drifting splinter in that system, feeding on the same trade it pretends to stand outside. For now, there is nothing to attack and nothing to flee. Still, the lookouts scan the dark for the blur of distant sails or the low black shape of an approaching squall, knowing that calm never lasts long here. You lean against the rail and listen past the creak of timber and the low snore of sleeping men until another sound rises. Your own thoughts, quieter than the ocean, but harder to escape. Between plunder and port, there is suddenly room for questions: how you ended up here, what you truly hope to gain, what waits for captured pirates in places like London, Boston, or Kingston where gallows are already built. Those thoughts drift through you like bits of wreckage on the tide, circling, never quite sinking, as the ship glides on into the long, suspended hours between raids. By the time the first light slides along the horizon, the ship has already turned you over in your sleep several times, like a restless hand rolling a coin. You wake on the crowded deck to the small sounds that always come before dawn at sea. A cough from somewhere near the mainmast, the soft slap of bare feet, the low murmur of a lookout, exchanging a few words with the next man up. The air is cooler now, the heat of the Caribbean night ebbing just enough to give you a single deep breath that doesn't taste of sweat. You push yourself up from the planks, feeling the stiffness in your back and shoulders. On some ships, there are hammocks slung below, borrowed from old Navy practice and strung in tight rows. On others, like this one, space is so limited and the crew so large that many men sleep wherever they can, wrapped in thin blankets, backs against cannon, heads on coils of rope. It's not the freedom of the open sea that wakes you, it's a boot nudging your foot as another sailor squeezes past, already moving toward the rail to relieve himself before the day truly begins. The sky overhead is just turning from black to deep grey blue, and you hear the familiar ring of metal as someone strikes the bell. Time aboard is divided into watches, 4 hours stacked on 4 hours, marked not by clocks, but by that steady pattern of bells. The men who've been on watch through the night are trading places now with those who slept, and you remember how this rhythm comes from the merchant and navy ships many of you once served on, stripped here of uniforms and strict formal ranks, but still beating quietly beneath the surface. As you stand, you catch the scent of wood smoke starting near the galley. The cook, often a pirate who lost a limb or was injured too badly for hard work aloft, has begun to stir whatever passes for breakfast today. On many days in this early 18th century Atlantic world, that means nothing more glamorous than hardtack biscuit, sometimes softened with water, and a bit of salted meat if you're lucky. Weevils in the biscuit are common. Men joke about them, some picking them out, others eating them for the extra protein and pretending it doesn't bother them. Historians reading old logs and sea journals note how often these same dull foods appear, the unchanging menu of long voyages. You join the slow shuffle toward the rail, where a few sailors are already washing their faces and necks with precious fresh water dipped from a small cask, careful not to spill. Water is life out here. Casks taken from captured merchantmen can extend a voyage, but no one can drink freely. You splash a handful across your face, feeling the grit of dried salt, and watch it drip back down to the planks. Some ships, especially when discipline holds, will holystone the deck in the morning, men on their knees, rubbing the planks smooth with soft blocks of sandstone, scouring away dirt and old blood. Whether this ship demands the same scrubbing depends on the mood of the leaders and how much they care about keeping a tidy appearance for their next target. When the call goes up, you join the others mustering midships. There's no brass-buttoned officer reading from a printed order here, but there is still structure. The captain stands with the quartermaster nearby, both of them watching the crew gather, counting almost unconsciously. Captains on pirate ships are elected, or at least accepted, by the men. They can be replaced if they show cowardice or cruelty outside battle. The quartermaster, elected too, holds the key to the stores, oversees discipline, and speaks for the crew. Surviving articles from ships like those led by Bartholomew Roberts or Edward Lowe describe this balance of power, rough, imperfect democracy at sea. You listen as the quartermaster's voice cuts through the low chatter, outlining the day, sail trimming, checking the rigging, splitting men into work parties. There's talk of tacking toward a shipping lane where English and Spanish merchantmen often pass, but for now, the horizon stays empty. Some scholars looking back will argue that these crews, drawn from the poorest layers of maritime labour, shaped their ships into floating protests against brutal wages and punishments ashore. Others will point out the simple fact that you and your shipmates live by robbery, and nothing in your articles protects the crews of the ships you hope to seize. Standing there in the morning light, listening to this day's orders, you can feel how both rebellion and predation live side by side in the same salt-stained faces. After muster breaks, you move toward the rigging. Some men climb, dark shapes against the brightening sky, to adjust sails that sagged or twisted during the night. Others check lines for wear, fingers running along rope that has seen years of sun and salt. A ship is a living thing, and pirates, despite their reputation for chaos, know that a neglected vessel dies quickly in these waters. Modern readers sometimes imagine pirates drifting lazily from raid to raid, but old accounts suggest constant work between prizes, repairing splintered spars, patching canvas, caulking seams, redistributing ballast after heavy loot shifts the ship's balance. You feel that ongoing labor in the pull of rope in your palms. By mid-morning, the sun has climbed just high enough that the deck begins to heat. Shadows shrink, and men start tying cloths around their heads. A few bare backs already show the long pale lines of healed lashes, reminders of former lives on navy or merchant ships where captains had legal authority to whip their crews. It is a detail that appears again and again in trial testimonies and narratives, sailors leaving that discipline behind, choosing a world where, in theory, no man is beaten without the crew's consent. Whether reality always matched that ideal is another question, but the scars speak of why the promise mattered. You help shift a small cannon a few inches to balance the weight along the gun deck, working with others in a slow, coordinated heave. Gun carriages rumble, iron fittings clank, and the smell of old powder rises from places where it has seeped into the wood over time. The last raid is still recent enough that you remember the smoke and shouting, though the planks have been scrubbed and much of the stain is gone. A few splinter scars remain in the rail, jagged and pale. They catch your eye the way old memories do, suddenly, sharply, then vanish again into the day's work. At the edge of the deck, two men argue in low voices about a watch missed, a duty shirked. The quartermaster wanders close, listening without stepping in. On many pirate ships, disputes over small matters are settled by the crew or by simple restitution. An extra chore, a deduction from the next share. For more serious offences, stealing from shipmates, for example, the articles recorded in period sources sometimes prescribe whipping, marooning, even death. Yet compared with some naval codes of the day, which could hang men for minor theft, pirates often appear strangely restrained. Historians still debate whether this restraint came from solidarity among desperate men or just from practical need. A small crew can't afford to cripple itself with constant brutal punishment. As the day stretches forward, the crowded deck begins to settle into familiar patterns. Men sort through their few belongings. A knife carefully wrapped in cloth, a small wooden cross, a worn deck of cards someone picked up in a waterfront tavern in Jamaica or the Carolinas. A young sailor rubs a pinch of tobacco between his fingers before pushing it into his cheek, his eyes half closed with the small comfort. Another runs a whetstone slowly along the blade of a cutlass, not in anticipation of immediate battle, but because tools left dull in salt air will fail when they are needed most. You look around and realize that almost no one wears anything like the costumes that later paintings and stage plays will give them. There are no neat rows of tricorn hats and gleaming belts. Instead, you see patched trousers, loose shirts bleached nearly white by the sun, kerchiefs of many colours knotted at the neck or over the hair. A few men decorate themselves with pieces taken from captured cargo striped cloth from India, a bit of lace, a coat cut down to fit a smaller frame, but most are dressed like what they are, working sailors in a harsh environment, clothing chosen for function rather than drama. The popular image of pirates, exaggerated across centuries of novels and films, grows from thin strands of truth woven thick with imagination. The sun climbs higher, the ship leans slightly under a steady breeze, and the crowded deck empties a little as some men go below to rest while others stay above to work and watch. You stay where you are for a moment, feeling the hum of this small, floating world under your feet. Between raids, this is what much of pirate life truly is. Waking sore on rough planks, answering the call of the watch, sharing boring food and necessary chores, all under a sky that gives no hint yet of prizes or storms. And in that ordinariness, crowded, uncomfortable, and full of small habits, you sense the quiet truth behind the legends. A pirate's life, between the flashes of danger, is as much routine as it is romance, as much weary repetition as wild freedom. By afternoon, when the sun has burned a pale path across the sky and the ship moves in an easy, steady roll, your thoughts drift from the work in your hands to the bargain that holds you here. Rope runs through your fingers, but your mind slips back to another deck, another captain, another wage that never seemed to arrive on time. You remember the pay promised on a merchantman out of London or Bristol, months at sea for a handful of shillings, paid late, if at all. Men finished long voyages still owing money for clothes and food bought on credit, while owners counted profits on sugar and tobacco. The captain kept the accounts locked in his chest, and everyone knew someone who had been cheated at the end of a journey by a quiet note in the ledger. Before this ship, perhaps you served under the king's flag as well, in a navy that could impress you by force, dragging you from a waterfront tavern into years of hard service. The articles of war posted on the gun deck spelled out punishments in cold language: lashes for disobedience, death for mutiny. Wages were small, often delayed, and the gulf between common seamen and commissioned officers felt wider than the ocean itself. Historians still argue over how typical the worst abuses were, but enough diaries and court records survive to show that cruelty and arbitrary power often lived on the lower deck. It was there that the first talk of going on the account, as men sometimes called turning pirate, began to sound less like madness and more like a grim kind of logic. The memory of a friend tied to a grating and flogged until his shirt clung dark to his back. The story of a shipwrecked crew denied their pay. Small injustices piling up until the promise of a different bargain at sea seemed worth hearing out. Here, on this wooden world flying no legal flag, that bargain is simple to state and hard to live. Shares instead of wages, risk instead of the illusion of security. When this crew first chose its leaders, you stood shoulder to shoulder with the others as rough versions of articles were read aloud, rules not imposed from a distant Admiralty, but agreed to by raised hands and shouted assent. Surviving examples from ships like those of Bartholomew Roberts and George Lowther show similar lists. The captain to receive 2 shares of any prize. The quartermaster, 1.5. Gunners and carpenters, perhaps 1.25. Ordinary seamen, a single share each. You remember the words about compensation, spoken plainly in the heat of a crowded deck. For the loss of a right arm, so many pieces of 8. For the loss of a leg, somewhat less. For a blinded eye, a smaller sum again. The exact amounts differ from ship to ship in the records, but the spirit is the same. If the work breaks you, the company owes you something, compared with the practice you left behind, where a crippled sailor might be discharged with nothing. These promises felt almost like justice. Of course, the justice here is harsh and uncertain. A share is only worth what you can seize. There are long spells, like this one, when no fat merchantman crosses your path, and the casks grow lighter week by week. Some historians describe occasional windfalls, Spanish silver or East India goods, divided out in glittering heaps. Others point to stretches of lean hunting. Ships turned away for being too small. Crews grumbling as provisions run low. You, leaning against the warm rail, know both stories. You have watched men squander a hard-won share in a few wild days ashore, then sign on again with empty pockets. The democracy you live under is real, but it has sharp edges. The captain can be removed if he is thought cowardly in battle or too harsh in calm weather. The quartermaster can be challenged if he is suspected of stealing from the common stock. Decisions about where to sail, what risks to take, and how to treat prisoners are debated in noisy assemblies. Some modern scholars see in this the shadow of a workers' revolt, a floating republic of outcasts. Others insist that any equality here applies only within a circle of thieves, and that the violence turned outward erases any claim to moral rebellion. Listening to arguments rise and fall across the deck, you understand how both judgments can be true at once. You think back to the moment you crossed the line. For many men, it came in the years after the War of the Spanish Succession, when peace treaties in the early 710 seconds left, thousands of seamen suddenly unemployed, their letters of marque worthless. Privateers who had once attacked enemy shipping with royal blessing found themselves unwanted. In ports from Jamaica to the Carolinas, some tore up their commissions, kept their weapons, and continued to prey on any ship they pleased. You might have been one of them, or you might have joined later, lured by tales of equal shares and quick profits. Either way, there came a day when you stepped aboard a ship like this knowing that, in the eyes of European law, you had crossed from legality into outright piracy. On that day, the bargain felt almost clean. No more standing by while officers took prize money. No more waiting months for a wage that might never come. Instead, you would risk your life in open defiance and, if you survived, take home a portion of the spoils large enough to buy a small farm, a tavern, or at least a few years of comfort. Whether many pirates ever truly managed, that is uncertain. Surviving records suggest that more ended at the gallows or disappeared without note than retired peacefully. Still, the hope persists, like a faint swell under the ship. You glance toward the quarterdeck, where the captain and quartermaster speak in low tones. Somewhere below, in a chest nailed to the deck or hidden behind barrels, lies the written copy of your articles, each man's name once scrawled or marked with an X. Those pages, when they survive to be read in distant courtrooms, will become evidence used against captured crews. For now, they are simply the fragile contract that binds you together, offering a kind of rough equality in the face of danger. The rope in your hands grows warm in the afternoon sun as you pull, and you feel the full weight of the hard bargain you have struck. No admiral will ever commend you for bravery here. No official pension waits if you lose a limb, yet your voice counts in council. Your share is not at the whim of a gentleman's mood, and the risks you run are acknowledged openly. Historians still argue whether this was a desperate leap toward fairness or just another path into violence. You, living it one long day between raids at a time, only know that the choice, once made, is not easily unmade, and that every quiet hour aboard this ship is bought with the knowledge of what may come when a sail finally appears on the horizon. The breeze freshens by late afternoon, and the ship leans a little harder into the swell, as if reminded that drifting is never truly rest. You feel it in the way the planks shift under your bare feet, and in the small sounds that follow: a groan from the timbers, the creak of strained rope, the faint clatter of loose things that should have been tied down. Between raids, this is where much of your life goes, not into daring pursuits, but into keeping this wooden world from slowly falling apart. You move along the deck with a bucket of pitch-stained tools, following the ship's carpenter. On a king's ship or a merchantman, his trade was respected but tightly controlled by officers. Here, in this loose brotherhood of the early 18th century Atlantic, his value is even more obvious. Without him, a sprung plank or shattered spar can turn a profitable cruise into a slow disaster. He taps as he walks, the handle of his hammer striking the planks and frames, listening for the dull note that means water has crept where it doesn't belong. It is a small ritual repeated again and again on voyages like this, rarely mentioned in romantic tales, but present in the dry details of old sea journals and logs. You kneel beside him when he pauses at a seam where two planks meet. The caulking twisted fibers of hemp or flax, known as oakum, has begun to show gaps, worked loose by constant flexing. You watch him pull out the worst of it, pack in fresh oakum with a caulking iron, and then smear hot pitch carefully over the seam to seal it. The smell of tar rises, thick and sharp, and you feel heat from the iron pot the cook has set aside just for this purpose. A careless seam, left to widen, will let in seawater that spoils food, gunpowder, and the men's last patience. Above you, other sailors are already aloft, moving in spider-like silhouettes against the sky. A sail tore slightly during the last squall, and today is as good a day as any to mend it. On some ships, there is a dedicated sailmaker who stitches heavy canvas with a curved needle while seated on deck. On others, half a dozen experienced hands share the work. Along the lee side, a swath of canvas has been spread out, and men bend over it, their fingers pushing needles through with leather palms. A patch today may mean a sail that doesn't split completely tomorrow when the chase is on and every scrap of wind matters. Near the rail, a group has been set to scraping the hull, where they can reach from small boats lowered over the side. Fouling barnacles, weed, and slime clinging to the submerged planks can slow a vessel enough to make the difference between catching a prize and watching it vanish over the horizon. In quiet anchorages, like those pirates favoured in the Bahamas or along the Cuban coast, whole crews sometimes careen their ships, heeling them over on a beach to expose their undersides for scraping and repair. Colonial complaints from the early 1700s mention such hidden coves, where sudden clusters of small armed vessels gathered like seabirds, busy not with raiding, but with maintenance. Today, your captain is not ready to risk a careen, but the scraping still helps. Men lean out over the side, ropes around their waists, using long-handled scrapers to peel away the slime. You can hear their muttered curses each time the ship lurches, soaking them in spray. It is not glorious work, but when you think of the narrow escapes you have already had, of a Spanish guarda-costa or an English frigate just failing to catch you, you understand why no one complains too loudly. On the gun deck, others tend to the weapons that define your trade. Cannon are swabbed, bores checked for cracks, carriages examined for rot. Salt air eats iron and wood alike, and powder stored too close to damp will misfire when you least can afford it. Men run oiled cloths over barrels, coaxing a bit of dull shine back into the metal. They check breechings, the thick ropes that keep a gun from recoiling itself across the deck, and tighten bolts shaved thin by repeated shots. In naval reports and trial evidence from this period, there are accounts of pirate ships whose guns burst or slewed, loose in action, turning weapons inward. You have no wish to join those stories. All the while, the ordinary routines continue. The deck is swept and, if the captain and quartermaster insist on it, holystoned, men on their knees with blocks of sandstone, rubbing in slow, circular motions until the planks grow pale and smooth again. In the navies of Britain and France, such labour could be a form of punishment as well as hygiene, but here it is mostly about keeping your home from becoming a stinking, Slippery hazard. Loose powder, grease, and scraps left to rot would make the next boarding party more dangerous for you than for the enemy. You catch snatches of conversation as you work. One man complains about a warped spar, swearing that the last prize's cargo shifted and cracked it before they could offload. Another talks about swapping out worn rigging for better rope, taken from a captured ship. Pirates, for all their outlaw status, live off the same maritime technology as everyone else. Stolen charts, captured tools, cannons taken from merchantmen or lightly armed escorts. Some historians emphasize this parasitic aspect, noting how pirate vessels rarely built anything entirely new. Others see a rough ingenuity in the way crews cannibalized and adapted whatever they could get. As the afternoon wears on, you pause by the rail again, hands aching and clothes streaked with pitch and dust. Looking along the length of the ship, you see it not as a symbol on a map or in a ballad, but as a fragile, constantly threatened machine. Every plank has been hammered into place, every line hauled and knotted, every sail cut and stitched by someone's tired hands. A gale in the wrong direction, a hidden shoal, a single cannonball from a patrol ship could undo all of it in moments. You remember that first night standing under the stars, when the ship seemed like a solid, eternal presence beneath your feet. Now you know better. Between raids, between the moments that will one day fill pamphlets and courtroom testimonies, most of your hours are spent fighting back the slow advance of rot, rust, and wear. Some scholars who write about the so-called Golden Age of Piracy argue that this constant maintenance shows how pragmatic these outlaws really were, far from the wild, careless figures of later legend. Others caution against reading too much virtue into necessity. A man can be both diligent with his tools and ruthless with his enemies. The sun begins to sink, throwing long shadows across the deck, and tools are finally gathered up, pitch pots covered, needles put away. The ship, rocked gently by the evening swell, feels a little tighter, a little more ready than it did in the morning. You wipe your hands on your shirt and look out over the darkening water, knowing that tomorrow will bring more of the same endless small acts of care for a vessel that carries both your freedom and your doom across the restless sea. When the tools are stowed and the last scrape of holystone fades, the mood of the deck begins to shift, almost as if someone has turned a dim lantern down towards something softer. The air is still warm, but the edge of the sun now brushes the water, staining the waves with a copper glow. Work parties drift apart, and in the gaps they leave, smaller circles form, men settling against the rail, on overturned buckets, or beside the guns, drawn together by the promise of cards, dice, and a brief escape from the endless horizon. You feel the pull of those little knots of laughter and low curses. The day has been long, full of tar and splinters, and the ship will not be any more seaworthy if you spend the evening staring out at empty water. So you wander toward one of the circles forming near the mainmast, where someone is already spreading a worn scrap of canvas to serve as a makeshift table. A deck of cards appears from a pocket, the pasteboard softened by years of damp and greasy fingers. The faces and suits are familiar in outline, though not all the cards match. Some have been replaced with roughly drawn substitutes after the originals went missing or rotted. Men slide in, knees drawn up, hands resting casually near their belts. The stakes are small at first. A twist of tobacco, a spoonful of sugar from a private hoard, a better share of tomorrow's watered rum. A few coins jingle, Spanish silver marked with the monarch's profile, English shillings battered at the edges. You've seen people lose more than they could afford in a single night, in ports like Port Royal in Jamaica or Nassau on New Providence Island, places that, in the early 1700s, were known as loose, noisy havens for sea rovers and runaway seamen. Here, on the deck between raids, the gambling is quieter but no less serious. You take your place, shuffling closer as the first hand is dealt. The game is not described in ballads, but its bones are simple enough. Cards laid down, tricks taken, muttered counting of points. Sailors have carried such games back and forth across the Atlantic for decades, picking up variations in taverns from Bristol to Boston. No one here bothers to name it grandly. It's just the game, shaped by whatever rules this crew has learned and agreed to. Some historians, looking at period references to all fours, or lantaloo among sailors, try to reconstruct exactly what was played. Others admit that in this world, rules were as fluid as the sea itself, shifting whenever a new man joined with a different way of scoring. As the hands move and the pile of small stakes in the middle shifts, you watch not just the cards but the faces. The big talkers during the day, the ones who shouted loudest when discussing the next cruise, grow quieter here, eyes narrowing in concentration. A man with a scar down his cheek taps his fingers gently on the canvas whenever he's pleased with his hand, a habit he may not know he has. Another scratches his beard when he's thinking of folding. You file these little tells away. On a cramped ship, you learn each other's patterns quickly, whether you intend to or not. A rattle of wood on wood announces dice at another circle a few feet away. The sound carries, sharp and familiar. You glance over and see a pair of sailors crouched in the shadow of a gun carriage, tossing small cubes into an upturned hat. The pips flash in the lantern light. Groans and short laughs rise with each throw. It's a sound that would have been common on merchant and naval ships as well, though in those more regulated worlds, cards and dice were often officially forbidden. Some pirate codes, like the surviving articles of Bartholomew Roberts in the 1722, even banned gambling for money on board, perhaps to prevent quarrels that could split a crew. Yet other crews clearly ignored such rules or never wrote them down. Historians still disagree on how strictly such bans were enforced. Stories of dice rattling on deck suggest that practice was always more flexible than parchment. In your circle, the play grows a little bolder. Men who swore they would only risk a mouthful of rum now slide a coin into the center, shrugging as if it means nothing. One boasts that he will win back the share he squandered in Nassau. Another promises to strip the shirt off the man beside him before the night is done. You know their stories, the wild days ashore when a hard-earned share vanished into drink, company, and the easy illusions sold in waterfront taverns. Period court records mention pirates arriving at trial with almost nothing to show for months of successful raiding, their fortunes drunk or gambled away in a matter of days. You feel your own hand warming, the cards growing familiar against your skin. A good run of luck can brighten a voyage, fund small comforts, and give a man something to dream about. Yet even now, you sense the edge beneath the laughter. A lost game can sour a friendship. A suspicion of cheating can ignite something far darker. You've seen men quietly mark a corner of a card with a fingernail, or palm a die that always shows high. Some crews tolerate a little trickery as part of the game. Others consider it theft from shipmates, punishable under their articles. Whether gambling binds a crew tighter or starts the cracks that later widen into mutiny is something historians still argue about. Reading between the lines of depositions and old pamphlets, the lantern above your circle shifts as the ship rolls, sending a beam of light sliding across the faces around you. Sweat gleams on foreheads, shadows carve hollows beneath eyes, cards slap softly onto canvas, the sound oddly soothing in its repetition. The smell of tar and salt mixes now with the sharper scent of rum as a small cup makes its way from hand to hand. No one is drunk yet. Most know better than to lose control at sea, but the first sips smooth the hard angles of the day, turn rough jokes into softer ones, and let the men lean a little closer without flinching from the memories pressed too near. You win a hand, then lose the next two. Your little pile of tobacco and coin shrinks, grows, shrinks again. In the glow of the lantern, it doesn't feel like much. But you know that for some of the men here, each twist of leaf and each dull coin carries weight. A share divided after a prize calculated according to the articles, checked by the quartermaster, can vanish into these quiet circles long before it ever reaches a tavern ashore. In a world where tomorrow's raid may fail and the next port may be your last, the urge to risk what you have now, to feel a brief rush of gain or loss, is hard to resist. Still, not everyone plays. You notice a sailor sitting with his back to a mast, hands busy with a bit of carving, eyes flicking now and then toward the games but never joining. Another leans on the rail, staring into the dark. Some men have wagers they no longer care to place, or debts they know they cannot afford to deepen. For them, The rattle of dice and the soft slap of cards serve as background music to their own private thoughts. As the evening deepens and the stars rise one by one, the games wear on. Voices grow hoarser, laughter a little slower. The air cools enough that someone pulls on a patched coat, careful not to disturb the small mountain of trinkets in front of him, a tiny, temporary kingdom of winnings that may be gone by the next watch. Looking at the curve of shoulders around you, you see how cards and dice, more than just idle entertainment, give shape to the long, formless hours between raids. They turn time into rounds and hands, into small stories of luck and loss that can be told and retold. Some future writers will imagine pirates as creatures of constant action, always boarding, always roaring. Yet here, with a card sticking slightly to your fingers and a dull coin resting on the canvas in front of you, you feel the deeper truth that much of this life is lived in these small, tense circles of chance. Whether you win or lose tonight, the sea will still be there in the morning, the ship will still creak and sway, and another day of waiting will begin. For now, though, you let the cards fall as they may, listening to the low murmur of your shipmates, while the long shadow of your choices lies quiet just beyond the edge of the lantern's light. By the time the cards are gathered up and the dice tucked away, a different kind of ritual begins to pull the crew together. The light has gone from copper to deep blue, and the first sharp breath of night air slides across the deck. Somewhere near the middle of the ship, you hear the scrape of a lid being hauled off a cask, the clank of a ladle against wood, and a voice calling men to the evening ration. You move toward the sound with the others, not exactly eager, but drawn by habit. At sea in the early 18th century, expectations are not high when it comes to food. You stand in a loose line, the ship rocking gently beneath you, and smell what's on offer tonight. A sour blend of salt and old fat, with the faintest edge of something smoky. The cook, one trouser leg pinned up neatly below the knee where a calf once was, leans over an iron pot. His missing limb marks him as one of those men whose injuries made hard work aloft impossible, but whose experience kept him useful. An arrangement mentioned in more than one account of pirate and naval crews alike. He ladles out a portion of salted meat, grey and stringy from long boiling to soften it. It might once have been beef or pork. The weeks in brine have erased most of the difference. Next to it lies a biscuit of hardtack, more stone than bread, baked dry enough to survive months in a barrel. You turn the biscuit in your hand and see the tiny bored holes that flour-sack weevils favour. Sailors have joked for decades that the insects at least add life to the meal. Some men knock the biscuit against the gunwale to shake them out. Others bite down without looking too closely, focusing on the bulk it puts in the belly rather than the details. Fresh food belongs mostly to the first days after a port, to the brief time when stolen or purchased vegetables and fruit have not yet rotted. In rare, generous moments, a prize ship gives more than just coin. Barrels of peas, sacks of flour, even casks of wine or brandy. You remember a short, glorious spell when the crew took a vessel carrying dried fish and cheese, the smell of which filled the hold for weeks. Yet such windfalls are unreliable, and most meals at sea blur into a steady, unremarkable sameness. Historians reading victualling lists and logs see a diet heavy on salt, fat, and starch, light on anything green. With your bowl in hand, you step aside to make room for the next man. The meat pulls apart in tough shreds. The broth has left a line of grease around the rim. You eat slowly, careful not to crack a tooth on some hidden hard bit of gristle. Around you, others do the same, leaning against the mast, the rail, or each other. The sounds of chewing and quiet comment mingle with the constant, gentle creak of the hull. No one pretends this is a feast, but a full stomach, even filled with such coarse fare, steadies the mind for a while. Then comes the other half of the ritual. A small barrel is rolled forward, bound in iron hoops, its wood stained darker where liquid has seeped. Rum, taken in bulk from captured Caribbean trade or purchased in rowdy ports, has become the common drink in this world. In earlier decades, sailors drank more beer. Out here, where heat spoils ale quickly, spirits keep better. On king's ships, regulations will evolve over the century to water rum down into what will come to be called grog, partly to keep men from drinking their ration straight. On this ship, as on many pirate vessels, the usual practice is more flexible. The quartermaster, or a trusted mate, stands with a measure in hand. When your turn comes, you hold out a cup or a small wooden mug, feeling the weight of eyes behind you. Fairness matters here. Too large a pour for one man, and not enough for another, can start quarrels that ripple far beyond a single evening. Trial testimonies and surviving articles make it clear that pirate crews took a dim view of anyone skimming from the common stock, rum included. The liquid splashes in, dark, sharp-smelling, the scent of molasses and fire. It promises warmth and a thin layer of ease over tired muscles and nagging thoughts. You lift the cup and take a careful sip. It burns at first, then spreads in a slow line down your throat and out along your limbs. A few men throw their rations back in one swallow, chasing a quicker blur. Others, like you tonight, let the rum linger, aware of the thin line between comfort and trouble in such a cramped world. Stories told centuries later will often paint pirates as constantly drunk, stumbling from brawl to brawl with bottles in hand. Contemporary records complicate that picture. There are accounts of crews so sodden they could barely fight, yes, but also of captains who forbade excessive drinking at sea, keeping rum under lock until the danger had passed. Historians still debate how often pirates were truly disciplined about alcohol, or whether such stories reflect wishful thinking by later apologists. Out here, with the ship beneath your feet and the cup in your hand, the truth feels more practical than principled. A man who cannot climb a shroud or load a cannon because of drink endangers everyone aboard. You glance at the faces around you. Already, the tightness in some shoulders has eased. A few smiles come quicker, and the muttering that accompanies every meal softens at the edges. Rum does not fix hunger or homesickness, but it sands off some of their sharpest corners for an hour or two. Men speak more freely of past voyages, of storms survived off Cape Hatteras, of strange lights seen near the Florida Keys, of taverns in Port Royal or Charleston, where music spilled out into the humid night. You know, too, what lies under that looseness. A man whose thoughts run too hard toward regrets or fears can sometimes keep them at bay with another sip, then another. A cup meant to warm becomes a shield against the memory of a merchant captain's rage, a navy officer's lash, or the eyes of a captured sailor begging for mercy during the last raid. Later observers will argue over whether pirates drank more heavily than other seamen. Some say the extra share of plunder made excess easier. Others point out that all sailors of this age lived with alcohol woven tightly into their days. Standing here, feeling the faint buzz behind your eyes, you sense that the difference may be less in quantity than in how frankly men admit what they are trying to forget. You take another sip and feel your shoulders loosen. The sky above has gone almost fully dark now, stars pricking through as the last smear of sunset deepens toward black. Somewhere forward, a man coughs hard, then falls silent. Scurvy, that slow thief that robs gums and strength when fresh food is rare, always waits at the edge of such voyages. Some captains, pirate and legal alike, try to secure citrus or other fresh provisions when they can, but knowledge about what truly prevents the sickness is uneven, and luck plays its part. Looking down into your cup, you feel a strange pairing of gratitude and unease. This ration, rough food, shared drink, is one of the few stable points in a life otherwise ruled by weather, chance, and violence. Yet it also reminds you of how thin the margin is. A barrel of meat gone bad, a cask of water spoiled, a shipment of rum lost overboard in a storm, any of these can turn a crew sour quickly. Around you, in the lantern's circle, men finish their portions, licking grease from fingers, wiping mouths on sleeves. Some laugh a little louder now. Others grow quieter, folding inward as the brief comfort of food and rum lets deeper thoughts rise. In this moment between the clatter of supper and the hush that will come later, you feel the ship as a kind of floating tavern and prison both, a place where rations and rum, however coarse, give rhythm to days that might otherwise blur into an endless, hungry waiting. You drain the last of your cup, tasting salt from your own skin on the rim, and hand it back with a nod. The barrel will be closed soon. The meat pot scraped clean, and the deck will sink into the softer sounds of evening. Hunger is eased, thirst quieted for now, but the deeper thirst, the one for something like safety, or forgiveness, or a life not weighed down by the choices that brought you here, lingers just beyond the reach of any ration. After the bowls are wiped clean, and the last of the rum has settled warm in your chest, the ship's sounds shift again, from clatter and clank to something softer, more human. The sky above is a deep, polished black now, the stars clear and sharp, and the lanterns on deck throw small, amber islands of light onto the planks. Men find their places the way they always do at this hour, some against the rail, some perched on gun carriages, some simply lying back with their hands behind their heads, staring upward. Out of this loose, drifting circle comes a different kind of tide. Songs, stories, and the easy lies that pass the time between one danger and the next. You hear it begin with a voice near the foremast. No one calls for silence. It just happens. A low melody threads itself into the air, unhurried, more like a drawn-out sigh set to notes than a performance. It's a work song, or at least it was once a hauling tune sailors have used on merchantmen and warships alike, turned now into an evening lullaby. The words name familiar things, old capstans creaking, anchors heaving up out of muddy harbours, the long pull of rope biting into calloused hands. Verses have drifted and reshaped themselves over years and oceans, so that by the time they reach your ears on this pirate deck in the early 1700s, they are part English, part nonsense, part memory. No one here worries about the original version. The song belongs to whoever sings it tonight. Others join in, not in perfect harmony, but in the rough, layered way of men who spend more time yelling orders into the wind than practicing any kind of choir. The chorus rises and falls with the sway of the ship. You feel yourself breathing a little easier in its rhythm. Sea songs like this rarely appear in official logs. They survive instead in scraps of verse and later collections, pieced together by people who never felt the deck move under them. Historians argue over which tunes were truly sung in this age and which are later inventions. But the core idea is not in doubt. Sailors, legal and outlaw alike, used music to pull together work and to hold off the weight of boredom. When the last line trails away, something brighter replaces it. A fiddle comes out, its varnish scarred by years of damp air, its strings replaced more than once by whatever gut or fibre could be spared. The fiddler settles himself atop a coil of rope, tucks the instrument under his chin, and draws the bow across the strings. A quick, lilting tune spills out a reel learned in an Irish port, perhaps, or on the Welsh coast, carried aboard because one man couldn't imagine life at sea without it. Sailors' accounts from this century sometimes mention fiddles and pipes aboard ships, small luxuries that weighed almost nothing but could transform a night. Soon, feet start to tap, one man claps along, another hums a counter-melody, and for a few minutes the ship feels less like a floating workplace and more like a cramped, swaying tavern. Someone attempts a few steps of a dance, only to be nearly pitched into a gun when the ship rolls. The laughter that follows is soft but genuine. You can almost see in the lantern light what Port Royal in Jamaica must have been like before the great earthquake of 1692. Shattered it, crowded streets, taverns spilling music into the humid dark, pirates and privateers weaving between merchants and enslaved labourers on a shore where coin and conscience parted ways easily. Talk turns, as it often does, to those ports. A man who spent time in Nassau, on New Providence Island, leans forward and begins describing it again. The broken-down fort, the half-ruined town, the way pirates in the 1710 seconds turned it into what some later called a commonwealth of pirates, a place where outlaws outnumbered honest traders. He tells of ships anchored so thick in the harbour that you could almost walk from deck to deck, of guns dragged back up onto the old fort's walls to give at least a show of defence if a Royal Navy squadron appeared. Contemporary letters from colonial governors complain about that very scene, New Providence teeming with sea robbers, though their tone is more anxious than romantic. As the fiddle quiets for a moment's rest, stories sharpen into names. One sailor swears he saw Henry Morgan once, years ago, in Port Royal, long before the buccaneer turned governor's death. He paints him taller, more fearsome, more everything than the surviving portraits suggest. Another claims to have sailed near Edward Teach Blackbeard during the blockade of Charleston in 1718, remembering the sight of slow-burning fuses woven into a tangled beard, sparking and smoking like the very edge of hell. You know that some of this is exaggeration. Even in their own day, notorious captains grew larger in the telling. Court records and colonial reports give numbers and dates. Sailors' tales stretch them into vivid shapes that fit better around a lantern. Bartholomew Roberts' name comes up too, as it often does. Black Bart, the Welshman said to have taken hundreds of prizes in only a few years. Men who have never sailed under him still talk as if they have, repeating rumours about the fine clothes he wore, the way he demanded order and music aboard his ship. Historians, combing through trial testimonies and official reports, count his captures and try to separate evidence from embellishment. You, listening in the dark, feel how little that distinction matters to the men around you. They need heroes and demons of their own kind, figures who moved through the same storms and fire but somehow for a time outran both. Not all stories are about famous names. Many are smaller, rooted in the everyday. A grey-bearded sailor tells of a tiny island somewhere in the Bahamas, where clear fresh water bubbled up from a spring hidden among the rocks, a place only a few crews knew and guarded as a secret refuge. Another remembers a Spanish guardacosta that turned away at the last moment, fooled by a hastily hoisted flag and a clever bit of signalling. A third talks of an evening in Charleston, where a man lost his entire share in a single night of dice, then laughed and signed on again the next morning, saying the sea was the only place he understood. These quieter tales rarely make it into any official account, but they anchor the larger legends in ordinary choices and accidents. Around the edges of the circle, the stories drift into stranger waters, talk of ghost ships, of lights seen moving silently along waves with no vessel beneath them, of the Flying Dutchman, already by this time a tale in circulation among sailors, though details vary from mouth to mouth. Some insist they have heard disembodied bells in fog. Others claim to have seen a drowned man's face in the curl of a wave. In an age when few can explain the deeper workings of weather or disease, superstition and faith blend easily. Historians later debate how seriously sailors took these omens, and how much of it was just nighttime embroidery on boredom. Listening to the hushed voices now, you suspect belief and storytelling were tangled together too tightly to separate. You add your own memories when someone nudges you. You speak of a narrow escape off the Spanish Main, of a storm that tore two sails to rags but left the mast standing, of a merchant captain whose hands shook as he offered up his keys and cargo. You leave out certain details, the look in one man's eyes, the way another fell, but the outline is true. Later ballads will smooth such stories into neat arcs of adventure. In the moment, they are messy and unresolved, threads that might lead anywhere. As the night deepens, the lies grow taller and the laughter softer. A man insists he swam from a wreck all the way to Barbados. Another claims to have hidden from a press gang by sleeping in a tavern's chimney for 3 days. No one believes every word, but no one demands strict proof. On a ship where tomorrow might bring battle, storm, or a long calm that rots the sails, there is something kind about allowing a friend his harmless exaggerations. Modern scholars sometimes argue about pirate culture in these hours, whether these songs and stories reveal a coherent shared identity or are just fragments of wider maritime life picked up and woven together. Some see in the tales of defiance against cruel captains and crooked merchants a rough sort of political consciousness. Others warn against reading too much meaning into what might simply be sailors doing what sailors have always done, turning their experiences, fears, and hopes into talk so that they do not have to face them in silence. The fiddle starts up again, slower now, and someone hums a wordless line beneath it. A few men, exhausted, slip away to find a place to sleep, rolling blankets around themselves on deck. The circle thins but does not break. You sit with your back against a warm plank, eyes half closed, listening as the voices blend into one another. Port Royal, Nassau, Charleston, London, the Spanish Main names, that once belonged to maps and proclamations drift here in the dark as half-remembered places, stitched together by rumour and smoke. Above you, the rigging sings a faint, high note in the breeze. The stars seem slightly closer than they did before the stories began. You feel the ship as a little moving island of sound in a vast, quiet sea. Songs fading, lies settling into shared memory. Truths half buried like anchors lost in deep water. Somewhere beyond the edge of the lantern's light, storms are forming, sickness waits, and the sea keeps its own long ledger of debts. But for this brief stretch between raids and reckoning, you let the stories wash over you, eyelids growing heavy, as the pirate world tells itself who it has been, and who, whether truthfully or not, it dreams of being. The night seems gentle enough when you finally stretch out to sleep, the last notes of the fiddle still humming faintly in your ears. The stars look steady, the breeze feels kind. The stories you've just heard soften the sharp corners of your thoughts. For a few hours, the ship is just a cradle on dark water, rocking you toward a thin, dreamless rest. Then, sometime in the deeper dark, the motion changes. At first it's subtle, a different angle to the roll, a sharper lift and fall under your ribs. A murmur moves along the deck as the watch calls quietly to one another. Eyes turn toward a patch of horizon that's gone from empty black to a smeared, indistinct grey. You sit up, blankets twisted around your legs, and feel the air on your skin. The wind has shifted. There's a weight in it now, a dampness that tastes of rain before any drops fall. Someone points, off to windward. Low clouds stack on each other like bruises, their edges lit now and then by distant flashes. In these waters, in this early 18th century Caribbean and Atlantic world, storms don't need much warning. Sailors still speak of the hurricane that tore apart the Spanish treasure fleet off Florida in 1715, scattering silver and bodies along the coast. You weren't there, but you've heard the story enough times to feel its shape. Ships snapped like twigs, masts sheared away, treasure chests thrown into depths no diver will ever see. It is one of many reminders that the sea keeps its own account books, settled in wind and water. The call goes up, sharper than anything you heard during the songs. Men scramble to their feet, sleep falling away in an instant. Orders cut through the night, shorten sail, take in the light canvas aloft, make her snug. The same men who, an hour ago, were hunched over cards and quietly humming verses, now move with brisk precision. You follow them toward the shrouds, fingers already reaching for rope. Climbing, you feel the ship lean harder, the wind tugging at your body. Above, the sails snap and strain. On merchant and naval ships alike, sailors have long known the steps. Strike the topgallants first, reef the topsails. Leave enough canvas to keep control, but not so much that the ship is dragged over. Pirates use the same seamanship. The lawlessness of your life does not exempt you from the rules of wind and cloth. Somewhere beneath you, the carpenter is checking the pumps and hatches, the master gunner making sure that loose powder is secure. A ship in a storm cannot afford stray sparks or unsecured guns. By the time you reach the yard, the wind is a living thing in your ears. You and the others haul at the reef lines, fingers numb as wet canvas slaps your arms and face. Below, the lanterns have been hooded or extinguished. Only the ghostly pallor of lightning gives you brief, stark flashes of the deck. The sea, so flat and dark a few hours ago, now heaves in sullen humps, white spray tearing off their tops. On deck again, soaked through, you feel the first true punch of the storm. Rain comes slantwise, hard enough to sting. Waves slap the hull, then rise, climbing, making the ship shudder. The helmsman fights the wheel, trying to keep the bow angled into the worst of it. Not broadside, where a single huge sea could roll the whole world over. Some ships heave to in such weather, setting their sails just so and letting the vessel ride it out. Whether your captain chooses that or presses on depends on the room he thinks he has and the shape of the coast in his mind's eye. You grab a line and wedge yourself near the mainmast as the deck tilts and bucks. Around you, men shout to hear one another over the roar of wind and water. The pumps begin to thump as volunteers work them by hand, drawing up sprays of cold, briny water that splash across their legs. Leaks that seemed trivial yesterday suddenly matter. You remember the carpenter's taps along the planks, the careful pitch pressed into seams. Every missed crack now becomes a thin, relentless thread of water feeding the bilge. In moments like this, the gallows on distant shores feel almost abstract. Death here is immediate, impersonal, neither judge nor jury involved. A misplaced step, a wave hitting just wrong, a line snapping under strain, any of these can send a man over the side. One shout, a brief flail in black water, and then nothing. Some historians suggest that sailors of this age feared such an end more than hanging, that the noose at least offered a crowd and a final word. Others argue that men rarely had the luxury of ranking their terrors. Danger was simply part of the air they breathed. Standing on a heaving deck, feeling the strain in every rope, you suspect the argument will never be settled cleanly. The storm does not last forever. Most squalls pass in hours, even if those hours feel stretched thin. Slowly, almost grudgingly, the violence eases. The thunder grows more distant, the rain softens, the worst gusts drop back into a steady, harsh wind. Dawn finds the sea still restless but no longer crazed, the waves running in long, uneven ranks away from the heart of the storm. Only then do you start to count the cost. A spar has cracked and will need a careful brace. One sail hangs in tatters and must be patched when the canvas is dry enough to work. A barrel has broken loose and shattered, leaving a sticky film of molasses across the deck that men will scrub at for hours. And there are bruises, twisted ankles, the deep, shivering exhaustion in every limb that comes after a night spent fighting not another ship, but the element that carries all ships alike. Storms are only one piece of the sea's steady claim. The other moves more quietly, creeping along veins and into bones. Sickness does not roar like wind, but it takes its due all the same. Even now, as men slump against the rail in the grey morning light, you see signs of it. One sailor flexes his swollen gums, muttering that they bleed whenever he bites into biscuit. Another's old scar, long since healed, has opened at the edges. These are classic marks of scurvy, that slow-wasting disease born of months without fresh fruit or vegetables. Some captains try to catch trade in limes or oranges when they can, but understanding of why such foods help is patchy at best. Fevers come and go, too. In the Caribbean and around West African coasts, sailors speak fearfully of seasoning the period when newcomers often fall sick with agues and chills. Likely the work of diseases like malaria and yellow fever, though no one on this deck knows the words. Men cough, sweat through their shirts in the night, then shiver in the heat of the day. On a ship like this, there is no surgeon trained in the newest theories. Only rough remedies, purges, bleedings, dubious powders, purchased from apothecaries in port. Sometimes they help, often they do nothing. Occasionally, they make matters worse. In cramped quarters, illness travels fast. A man's quiet cough becomes a chorus within days. Someone develops a rash that others eye nervously, remembering stories of smallpox outbreaks that tore through crews. Records from naval and merchant ships of the time are full of such notes. Ex-men, sick with flux. Y died this week of fever. Pirates draw from the same pool of bodies. They do not magically escape the invisible currents of infection. Some historians argue that pirate crews, being smaller and more mobile, might sometimes have avoided the worst epidemics. Others counter that their habit of cramming extra men aboard and living rough made them just as vulnerable. You watch as the quartermaster checks on a man slumped near the forecastle, his skin sallow, his eyes unfocused. There is no real question of stopping the voyage for one sick sailor. The ship must move, prize or no prize. His hammock will sway with the rest, his groans blending into the usual sounds of the hold. A friend might share a bit of extra rum, a corner of blanket, a few murmured words. Beyond that, there is little to be done. When people later speak of pirates, they often picture only the bright flashes, the black flag, the boarding axes, the shouted threats. Very few songs dwell on nights spent bailing in cold water, or days spent watching a friend fade from some nameless fever. Yet those quiet miseries weigh just as heavily on the balance as any captured cargo. Some scholars suggest that the readiness with which men signed articles promising compensation for lost limbs or eyes shows how constantly they lived with the expectation of harm. Others wonder if such clauses were more hopeful than practical, a way of pretending that the sea's debts could ever truly be paid. By midday, the sky has cleared again. The storm is already a memory, receding behind you in a smear of grey on the horizon. The ship creaks, patched and sore but still moving. Men stretch stiff muscles, check bruises, and, where they can, drift back towards small routines, tying off new lashings, wringing water from clothes, muttering thanks under their breath to whatever powers they believe kept them from slipping over the side. You stand at the rail, watching sunlight break in scattered flashes on the long swell left by the storm. Somewhere far away, gallows still wait in Kingston and London and Boston, their beams dry under a calm sky. But out here, you feel the sea's claim more keenly. Between raids, it is not the law that presses closest, but the weather and the slow, unseen work of hunger and illness. The noose belongs to men, the storm and the fever belong to a larger, older order, one that takes what it will with no need for verdicts. The day after the storm feels oddly hushed, as if the ship itself were catching its breath. The sky is high and clean, the swell long and lazy, and apart from the creak of rigging and the slap of water on the hull, little disturbs the calm. Men move more slowly, nursing bruises and sore muscles, speaking in fragments rather than full tales. In that thin, quiet, another kind of weather gathers a different sort of danger that does not roar like wind or crash like waves, but travels in words. The law. You sit cross-legged beside a gun, patching a tear in your shirt, when you realize the talk around you has shifted. No longer storm stories or songs of Nassau, but something harder. Near the mainmast, two men lean close, voices low, their eyes not on the sea but on some faraway shoreline they can see only in memory. You pretend to focus on your needle, letting their words slide toward you over the planks. They speak of an act passed back in London at the end of the 17th century, an act for the more effectual suppression of piracy, and of later measures that let governors in the colonies hang men without sending them across the ocean. Once, so they say, pirates had to be shipped all the way to England to face the Admiralty court at London's execution dock. Now, Vice Admiralty courts in Jamaica, Barbados, Boston, and the Carolinas can try cases nearer to the waters where plunder was taken, with no local juries to pity men who look too much like their own kin. One sailor, rolling a twist of tobacco in his fingers, sketches execution dock in a few spare lines. The gallows by the Thames, bodies of condemned pirates left hanging until the tide has washed their feet 3 times. Whether the picture comes from his own eyes or from printed broadsides, passed from hand to hand, hardly matters. By now, that image belongs to every man who has ever looked at a black flag with his stomach clenched. Others add scenes closer to this ocean gallows by the harbours of Boston or Charleston, crowds gathering to watch as captured crews pay the king's price. The ship rises and falls gently under you, the motion almost lulling, which makes the talk feel sharper. Storms you can understand. You see them build, feel the wind grow heavy, smell the rain. The law is different. Its clouds gather in rooms you will never walk through, in Parliament halls in London, in governors' mansions in Jamaica, and yet its lightning somehow finds its way to you all the same. Someone mentions the royal proclamations that have begun to circle through taverns and forecastles in recent years. In 1717, King George I issues a pardon, they say, promising mercy to pirates who surrender within a fixed time and swear to live honestly thereafter. Bits of the proclamation have drifted down the trade routes. Men in Port Royal and New Providence argue over the exact wording, over which crimes it covers, and which names are already too stained to be forgiven. Historians will later debate how generous these pardons truly were, whether they were meant as real clemency or simply as bait to draw scattered wolves into a pen. But on deck, the questions are more immediate. Do you trust a paper in a governor's hand? One man asks, brow furrowed. He has heard tales of former pirates in New Providence who took the king's grace and found themselves pressed into the Royal Navy afterward. their freedom exchanged for a different kind of rope and discipline. Whether such cases were common or rare is not clear. Rumours at sea grow like mould in damp corners. But even a few stories like that are enough to make the idea of kneeling in a colonial courtroom seem less like salvation and more like another trap. Names surface again, as they did in last night's stories, but now their endings are heavier. Captain Kidd, once a commissioned privateer, hanged after politics turned against him. Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate who tried to flee capture near the Carolinas and swung in Charleston in 1718. His final words reported and embellished in printed accounts sold on crowded streets. Whether those speeches were exactly as printed or tidied up by fearful printers is hard to say. What matters to the men around you is the pattern. Brave in battle or not, once on shore in chains. Even the most famous captain stands small beneath a timber crossbeam. You glance toward the horizon, a thin blue line with no land in sight, and it strikes you that to the statutes being discussed, this calm hour and your bloodiest boarding are part of the same crime. The law does not distinguish between a pirate reading cards on deck and a pirate storming a merchantman's rail. It lists axe robbery at sea, assault, mutiny, and once a man has signed articles and taken his share, the ink in London might as well have his name on it, even if no clerk has written it yet. A younger sailor, face still more boy than man, asks whether anyone ever truly walks free. A few shrug. One remembers hearing of a crewman who proved he was forced aboard and took the first chance to escape. Another mutters that such mercy is rare and reserved for stories that fit what a governor wants to hear. Modern historians, combing through dusty trial records, will later find the occasional acquittal or commuted sentence, but they will note how overwhelmingly the verdict falls one way. Out here, you don't have the numbers. You have only the feel of the odds, and they are not in your favor. Eventually the talk thins. No one can hold the shape of a gallows in his mind for long without needing to look away. Someone cracks a weak joke about a judge who wouldn't know stem from stern. Another spits neatly over the side and declares the sea his only magistrate. Laughter follows, not quite easy, but enough to let the air loosen again. The murmur shifts back toward cards and women and ports remembered in warmer colours. Still, when you bend again over your mending, the needle dipping in and out of cloth as the ship breathes beneath you, the images stirred by the conversation linger. You see, in your mind's eye, not only waves and storm clouds, but also river mud at low tide, a wooden beam against a grey sky, and rows of faces turned upward to watch men at the end of their road. Later writers will argue over how much fear of the noose truly weighed on pirates' minds, whether it tempered their violence or drove them to greater recklessness. Sitting here on a quiet day after a storm, you do not see all the causes and consequences. You feel only that somewhere beyond the horizon, law and empire are moving slowly but steadily in your direction, like a distant weather front no one on deck can yet see. But everyone, in some quiet corner of the mind, has already begun to sense. Later that same day, when the talk of acts and gallows has thinned into mutters and then into silence, you find yourself drawn away from the knots of men toward a quieter corner of the deck. The sea is almost painfully calm after the storm, a flat, glittering expanse that gives you nothing to fix your gaze on. With nothing out there to watch, your eyes turn inward. You sit with your back against a warm plank, a scrap of paper in your hand. It was taken from a prize, a merchantman carrying barrels and cloth, and tucked into a captain's small chest, a bundle of writing paper, finer than anything most of the crew ever sees. The quartermaster let a few sheets go, more out of indifference than generosity. Ink, too, can be found if you know where to look. A bottle half empty from the clerk's desk on a captured ship, a pen nib salvaged from a broken inkwell. You stare at the blank surface for a long moment. Around you, the ship is busy with small tasks. Someone oiling a musket, someone else mending a line, two men arguing cheerfully over the best way to rig a jury mast, if the main one ever goes. The deck under you rises and falls in a slow, almost comforting rhythm. If you let your lids droop, you could almost drift in that motion, letting the salt wind scour your mind clean. Instead, you think of land, not of Nassau or Port Royal, with their noisy taverns and crooked streets, but of places further away and quieter. A village in Devon or Cornwall, a small town in Brittany, a hamlet somewhere along the Welsh coast, maybe a narrow lane in London, where washing hangs between leaning houses and the smell of coal smoke lingers even on clear days. Wherever your mind settles, it carries with it the image of someone you left behind, a wife, a mother, a child you last saw as a bundle in another person's arms. Pirate trials and depositions from this time are full of such fragments. Men who, when pressed, mention families tucked away in distant parishes, wives who thought their husbands still honest sailors, children who would never see them again. Some historians have pointed to these hints to argue that pirates were not rootless monsters, but men torn between two worlds. Others caution that those same men might have invoked wives and children in court, hoping to soften a judge's heart. Looking at the page in your hand, you feel how little such arguments matter to the person who might one day read the words you are trying and failing to begin. You scratch out a halting salutation. The letters are uneven. Like many sailors, your hand is more used to rope than quill. Men who cannot write at all will sometimes ask a literate shipmate to act as their hand, shaping their rough-spoken words into neat lines, a practice attested in merchant and naval records, as well as in the odd pirate document that survives. You've done that once or twice for others. Doing it for yourself feels stranger. What do you say? You could write about the weather, about the way the sea looks at dawn, about the strange beauty of flying fish skimming the waves. You could lie and tell them you are still serving under some legal flag, that your wages might be slow but they will come, that you will be home when this voyage is done. Many sailors have written such half-stories over the decades, smoothing the roughness of their reality before it crosses the long miles to land. But the ink on your fingers feels like something heavier than that. You pause, aware that every word you set down could one day be read by someone you care about, or by a magistrate in a room you will never see. There are cases in the records where intercepted letters, found in captured chests or seized in ports, were used as evidence of a man's associations and voyages. Whether many pirates truly feared that possibility, or whether those who wrote simply chose to risk it, is hard to say. Sitting here, you cannot shake the thought that the wrong phrase might someday be read aloud by a stranger in a wig. You try to thread a line between truth and protection. You write that you are well, that you are at sea, that you have enough to eat. You do not write about the black flag bundled in the captain's chest, or the last merchantman whose crew stood white-faced as your ship ran alongside. You mention a port Jamaica, perhaps, or Barbados, without saying what you did there. You write that you hope, one day, to send enough money to settle debts, to see a child apprenticed, to keep someone far away from the press gangs and poorhouses that stalk the streets of London and Bristol. The ship sways. A blot of ink spreads where your pen pauses too long. You press your thumb to it, smudging it into something almost decorative. Around you, more than one man is doing the same thing in his own way, staring into middle distance, lips moving as if in conversation with someone not present. Whether they hold paper or not, the letters their minds draft follow similar paths, circling through apologies, promises, small reassurances. You remember a story told by an older sailor about a friend whose letter actually made it through. He had entrusted it to a sympathetic merchant captain, one who agreed perhaps for a small bribe to carry the folded, sealed sheet back to England and see it posted. Months later, in some harbour tavern, word came back that the wife had received it, that her tears on reading it were evidence enough that, for once, ocean and war and chance had not swallowed a message whole. Historians cannot track such personal currents easily. Archives preserve the rare letter that survives in an official bundle, not the many that were lost, undelivered, or quietly burned by those who feared what they revealed. You wonder, as you look at the lines you've scratched, whether this sheet will ever leave the ship. To send it, you would have to trust someone, another captain, a tavern keeper, a clerk in some colonial port. You would have to risk that the name at the top might one day be called in a courtroom instead of at a doorway. The thought makes your chest tighten. Some men fold their letters anyway, seal them with a smear of wax, and place them carefully in small wooden boxes among their few treasures. Others never quite reach that point. Trial inventories occasionally list unsent letters found in pirates' chests, words meant for wives, brothers, parents, frozen forever at the moment before decision. Scholars argue about what those unsent pages mean. A sign of last-minute remorse, a lack of trust in any pathway home, or simply the result of a life cut short before a chance to hand them off. You, turning your own sheet over in your hands, feel that the reasons might be all of those things at once. You read what you have written. The phrases look awkward, but earnest. You have not confessed, but you have not lied entirely either. You've put down enough that someone who knows you might hear your voice between the lines. For a moment, you imagine the letter's journey. Folded, pocketed, passed from hand to hand, up some river, finally slipped through a door, or placed in someone's fingers. You see a face bending over it in lamplight, lips moving silently as they follow the strokes of your clumsy pen. Then another image intrudes. The same page laid flat on a magistrate's table, a finger tapping at a place where you were less cautious, a clerk reading the words aloud to a room of strangers. The dual life of everything you do at sea, that it may be remembered either in private grief or in public judgment, presses close. In the end, you fold the paper anyway, not sharply, as if readying it for a journey, but loosely, as if unsure whether it will ever travel. You tuck it into a small oilskin pouch with a few other things that tie you to land. A lock of hair, a ribbon, a scrap of cloth from a dress long gone. You place the pouch back in your chest and close the lid. Maybe, one day, in some crowded harbour, you will find someone you trust enough to carry it. Maybe the opportunity will never come. Maybe the chest will be broken open in a navy hold or in a court's back room. Your private words turned into exhibits in a case you will not live to hear. Historians will later sift through such fragments, trying to decide what they say about the hearts of men who flew the black flag. Some will see in them simple hypocrisy. Others will argue that they reveal a constant painful tug between the lure of plunder and the pull of home. You only know that tonight, as the sky darkens again and the first stars appear. There exists somewhere on this ship a thin, folded bridge between the life you live and the life you left. Whether it ever reaches the far shore is a question the sea and time have yet to answer. Night on the ship never quite brings silence. It brings a different kind of noise, the soft ones that don't have to shout to be heard. The heavy clunk of the pump slows to an occasional groan. The rigging hums faintly in the breeze. Somewhere a man coughs, turns over, then sinks back into the kind of sleep that comes when you've spent all the day's strength on rope and wood. You lie awake on the deck, back against a coil of line, watching a strip of sky framed by rigging. Stars hang there like cold lanterns, unbothered by the small human story beneath them. You feel the ship move under you, that long, slow lift and fall that has become as familiar as your own breathing. In that gentle motion, your thoughts refuse to settle. You think first of the most recent raid, because it is the one that comes easiest. The memory carries the smell of powder and the taste of iron at the back of your throat. A merchantman, not far from the routes that skirt the Spanish Main, somewhere off Hispaniola or the Windward Passage. You remember spotting her sails first, as pale flecks against the horizon, then as full bellies of canvas when you altered course to intercept. Flags were swapped, signals tried. The old tricks every crew in this early 18th century Atlantic knows. Then the run alongside. Cannon run out, match ready. The sudden thunder that makes your bones ring. You recall the crash of splinters as your shot tore into her hull. The shouted surrender before anyone on either side truly wanted to test how brave they felt. Some historians argue that many pirate crews preferred such quick capitulations, both to save lives and to preserve the cargo. Others point out that not every captain lowered his colours in time, and that when resistance was stubborn, things went much worse. In your case, that day, the white fabric went up early, hands rose, and blood, at least the kind that stains decks, was kept to a minimum. You picture the boarding still, the way your boots hit their planks, the way the other crew backed away, eyes wide, voices stuttering over answers to sharp questions. You remember pockets turned out, keys handed over, Chests opened one by one under the quartermaster's supervision. Barrels rolled, bales cut, lists checked. It is all so methodical when you lay it out like that. Almost like a clerk's routine, except that every step is edged with fear. What stays with you most, lying here in the dark, is not the glitter of coins or the smell of spilled sugar. It is faces. A young sailor with his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscle jump. An older one whose hands shook as he gripped the rail. A captain who tried to look proud and failed when his gaze flicked toward a boy near the foremast's son, nephew, or just someone who reminded him of home. You took what your articles said you were due. You did not kill anyone who had thrown down arms. On some ships, articles explicitly forbid harming surrendered men, a rule mentioned in a few surviving codes and echoed in later accounts. Whether those rules were always honored is another matter. You have heard stories that say otherwise. You turn on your side, the rope under you digging into your ribs, and the questions that the day's bravado held at bay now arrive, one by one. How different are you, really, from the captains and owners whose greed drove you to this life? You tell yourself, as men around you often do, that merchants and plantation lords are no better, that they grow rich on the backs of sailors and enslaved labor, that you are only seizing a share of what was wrested from others first. Some modern scholars see in such arguments a rough kind of social protest, a twisted mirror of justice. Others say that whatever the grievances, the violence you've chosen answers injustice with more of the same. You can feel both verdicts hovering over you, as if a court and a conscience were sharing the same bench. Memories blur. An officer who beat his men now merges with a merchant captain who trembled when your boarding party crossed his rail. A navy boatswain's lash crack joins with the sound of your own boots on someone else's deck. Between storms and hunger and the heavy hand of the law, it would be easy to push all this aside and tell yourself that survival alone justifies every choice. And yet, here in the long hours, when no prize is in sight, your mind insists on circling back. Somewhere to your left, a man shifts and mutters. A name slips out of his mouth, quiet and thick with sleep. It is not the name of anyone on this ship. Perhaps it belongs to a wife in Bristol, perhaps to a child in Nantes, perhaps to a brother left behind in some cold northern fishing town. Court testimony sometimes preserves such details by accident. Pirates explaining, often too late, that they meant to go home after one more voyage, that they had families waiting. Historians argue about whether such claims were sincere or calculated. Listening in the dark, you hear nothing but the raw edge of longing. Above the soft snoring and the creak of timbers, another sound rises now and then. A whispered prayer. Not everyone on this deck believes in much beyond wind, rope, and their own knife, but enough men were raised in church-going villages that some old habits still cling. You catch bits of it, fragments of the Lord's Prayer, a plea for forgiveness, a promise to leave the sea after this cruise, if only someone, somewhere, will grant safe passage home. In sermons, back in England and New England, preachers thunder against sea thieves and warn that repentance at the gallows may come too late. On this ship, repentance is quieter and more uncertain, spoken into the dark by men who do not know whether they will ever be given a chance to prove it. You close your eyes and see again the unsent letter hidden in your chest. The words you chose so carefully, half-truths and hope mixed together, float up like scraps of sail in a harbour tide. You imagine them read with tears, or not read at all, or read coldly by a judge who will never know the taste of salt on his lips at midnight. The double life of every feeling, you harbour tenderness for those at home. Ruthlessness at sea presses like weight on your ribs. Some future writers will make pirates simple creatures, bold villains without doubts, or misunderstood rebels without real victims. Lying here, listening to the low breathing of your shipmates and the faint slap of water against the hull, you know that the truth is messier. In the quiet between raids, courage and fear, cruelty and kindness, pride and regret, all share the same narrow planks. Some scholars insist that pirates died as they lived, unrepentant, defiant to the last. Others find hints in last letters and confessions of men torn apart by what they had done. You don't know which kind of ending will be yours. All you know is that on nights like this, when the sea is calm and no lookout has called sail, for days, the ghosts of your own choices are louder than any storm. They are there in the remembered flinch of a captured sailor's shoulders, in the line of ink on a folded page, in the half-heard prayer 2 hammocks over. The ship rocks, a slow, forgiving motion, as if trying to lull you past the tightness in your chest. You focus on that, the faint sway, the soft rasp of rope, the regular hush of waves against wood. Regrets do not vanish, they drift, thinning a little at the edges, like mist over a harbour just before dawn. Eventually, your eyelids grow heavier, the stars blur, and as sleep finally rises to meet you, the last thing you feel is the old, familiar paradox of this life that on a pirate ship between raids, the quietest hours are often the ones most crowded with things no one ever says aloud. Morning comes with a different kind of light when land is near. You feel it before you see it, the way the crew moves just a little quicker, the way eyes linger longer on the horizon, the way even the most tired men find reasons to come up on deck. After days or weeks of nothing but sea and sky, a darker smudge appears ahead, low and solid against the glitter. Someone calls out, and the word ripples along the ship. Landfall. You step to the rail and squint. At first it's just a blur, but slowly it shapes itself into a line of shore, a shallow curve of sand, and behind it, the faint rise of scrub and palm. As you draw nearer, details sharpen. A cluster of roofs, a few masts in a sheltered anchorage, the broken teeth of an old fort on a hill. You've seen this place before. New Providence Island, Nassau, one of the most notorious harbours of your age. In the early 1710 seconds, Nassau has become what some colonial officials angrily call a nest of pirates, though they rarely use words so mild. You can see why as the ship slips closer. The harbour is busy in a way that feels different from proper ports like Kingston or Bridgetown. Masts crowd the anchorage, but many of the vessels riding there are small, fast sloops and brigantines like your own, their sides bristling with more guns than any honest trader of their size would carry. Some show flags in tatters, others fly nothing at all, as if refusing even the pretense of a nation's colours. On the hill above the town, the old fort once meant to guard this British colony sits in disrepair, its walls patched with whatever stone and timber the locals could find. Stories circulate of pirates dragging captured cannon up there themselves, turning the king's abandoned bastion into their own makeshift stronghold. Colonial letters from governors complain about just that, about outlaws using the ruin as a lookout, a symbol that the crown's grip on this little island has slipped. As your anchor rattles down and bites into the sandy bottom, a strange feeling rises in your chest. Relief. Certainly solid ground means fresh food, dry sleep, the possibility of a night without the ship's constant motion, but also a kind of disbelief. After days of living in a world defined entirely by rope and wave, the sight of chimneys and pathways and stationary trees feels almost unreal, as if you're stepping into a story told so often you've forgotten it was about a real place. Boats go over the side, and you clamber down into one with the others, oars creaking in their locks as you pull toward shore. The closer you get, the more Nassau smells reach you. Wood smoke, saltfish, unwashed bodies, spilled rum, and underneath it, all the faint sweetness of rotting fruit. The beach is busy. Men wade out to meet arriving boats, calling greetings, asking news of prizes and patrols. A few women stand back a little, watching with measuring eyes. Some are free, some bound to taverns or households, some perhaps hoping to secure passage away from this island on whatever ship will have them. You step onto sand that gives slightly under your boots, the shift from swaying planks to yielding earth making your legs feel unsteady. Ahead, the town crouches low, more a sprawling village than a true city. Wooden houses, leaning sheds, a few structures of stone still scarred by older raids and storms. Chickens scratch in the dust. Goats wander across the path, unbothered by curses. Not far away, you hear the clink of hammer on metal. Someone is already patching a gun, carriage, or shaping a new tool. the same craft as on the ship, just under a different sky. Taverns form the true heart of this harbour. You follow the current of the crew toward one of them, ducking beneath a warped signboard painted with some crude emblem. A bottle, a ship, a mermaid whose proportions owe more to the owner's imagination than to anatomy. Inside, the air is thick and dim, lit by a few smoky candles, and whatever light can struggle in through open shutters. Rough benches press up against equally rough tables, their surfaces scarred by knives and stained by countless spills. The crowd is mixed, in a way that would make more respectable ports uneasy. You see men with the look of English sailors, French and Dutch accents at one table, a group of Afro-Caribbean men at another, some free, some perhaps recently escaped from bondage on nearby plantations, drawn here by rumours of crews that will take any strong pair of hands. Contemporary descriptions of pirate haunts hint at this blend, though they often glide over the lives of the black and indigenous people who shared these spaces, except when describing them as servants or curiosities. Modern historians have tried to fill in those silences, suggesting that pirate harbours like Nassau sometimes offered flickers of opportunity, or at least different hierarchies, for people pushed to the margins elsewhere. Others warn that we shouldn't mistake such places for true havens of equality. Power and exploitation travelled with pirates as surely as their cannons did. For now, coins jingle, mugs clatter, and the tavern owner's eyes follow every movement of silver and gold. Your own share, counted out under the quartermaster's supervision before you came ashore, rests heavy in a pouch at your belt. Pieces of 8, English crowns, odd coins from Spanish and Portuguese mints, all jumbled together. It would be enough, handled carefully, to keep a modest family in comfort for months in some inland town. Here, in Nassau, that same heap tends to melt like ice in the sun. Drinks arrive quickly. Rum, mostly, sometimes cut with water, sometimes not. A little wine or brandy if a recent prize carried it. You sip at first, letting the room move around you, the roar of laughter from a table where dice are rolling, the shrill scrape of a fiddle in the corner, the low murmur of bargaining between a sailor and someone offering more private company. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, taverns across the Caribbean and American seaboard serve as more than just drinking places. They're hiring halls, information exchanges, pawn shops, and, for some, the closest thing to a home sitting room they'll ever know. You catch scraps of news in the swirl of voices. A royal governor, rumoured to be on his way, sent at last to clean out the pirate strongholds. Another pardon proclamation making its rounds, with men arguing loudly over whether it's genuine, generous, or just a prelude to rope. Someone swears that Woodes Rogers himself is coming, this former privateer turned colonial governor who, in 1718, will indeed arrive in Nassau with soldiers and ships, offering the king's grace with one hand and the threat of force with the other. Some scholars later describe this as the beginning of the end for Nassau's brief life as a pirate republic. Others note that the town's chaos never fully disappeared. It merely shifted under new names and flags. Around you, your shipmates spend with a kind of frantic generosity. New shirts to replace the ones torn by salt and rope. Better knives, traded for old ones worn thin by sharpening. A length of bright cloth tied at the neck or around the head. A small luxury that sets a man apart for a few days. On some tables, coins pile higher than they ever will again, only to scatter in an evening under the hands of tavern keepers, gamblers, and those who know how to profit from a sailor's brief freedom. You walk outside for a moment, the noise behind you spilling through the open door onto the street. The harbour lies quiet beyond, the ship's lanterns bobbing softly. Somewhere farther along the shore, small fires burn where people have set up rough camps, sailors between berths, women and men who live in Nassau's shadow economy, traders who prefer not to ask too many questions about where goods come from. The line between pirate and merchant and settler blurs here more than official documents will ever admit. Historians looking back at places like Nassau, Port Royal before the earthquake, and certain corners of Charleston or New York see them as pressure valves in the great machine of empire, places where the violence and inequality of the wider Atlantic world pooled and briefly turned on itself. Some argue that pirate enclaves formed a kind of makeshift, temporary alternative to that system, with their own rules and rough attempts at shared power. Others counter that whatever small freedoms they offered were built atop stolen labor and goods, no less entangled in exploitation than the plantations and trading houses they defied. You feel that tension even as you breathe more freely on solid ground. This harbour is both haven and trap, both market and mirage. It lets you forget, for a night or a week, the cramped hammocks and the ceaseless watch for sails on the horizon. It gives you music, laughter, and the illusion that money will always flow in as easily as it flows out. But it also reminds you, in the glint of a colonial officer's coat at the far end of the street, or in the whispered rumour of a navy ship seen nearby, that this freedom is always conditional, always temporary. As the moon rises over the low roofs and the tavern's din swells again behind you, you stand for a moment in the dusty street and feel the pull of both worlds. The sea offers danger and a kind of equality that few men of your station find on land. The land offers roofs, rootedness, faces that might one day know you as something other than a name in a ballad or a line in a court ledger. Between raids, between pardons and patrols, these harbours of temporary freedom are the only places where those possibilities touch. However briefly, you turn back toward the light and noise, coins still in your pouch, salt still on your skin, knowing that in a few days the anchor will come up again. The horizon will swallow the land, and all of this, the taverns, the rumours, the fragile sense of being almost ordinary, will shrink behind you until it's just another distant shore in a life that never quite belongs to either sea or land. You feel the first cracks before you can see them. They're there in the way voices sound when the anchor's raised again, in the brittle edge of jokes as Nassau's low roofs slide back down under the horizon. The ship is provisioned, the casks topped up, the hull scraped, as well as time and tools allowed. Shares from the last cruise have jangled through taverns and market stalls and are now mostly gone. Some sewn into clothing seams, many turned into drink, dice, or favours. What remains is a mix of full bellies, thinner purses, and a restlessness that has nowhere to go but sideways. At first, it shows up in small ways. A man snaps over a borrowed knife, not returned on time. Another bristles when someone jokes about how quickly his shore money vanished. Card games that used to end in lazy shrugs now end with narrowed eyes and tighter fingers on coins. You can feel it in yourself too, the faint sting when you think about what your share could have bought in some quiet town far from the sea if you had taken a different path. The quartermaster calls the crew together one afternoon to settle the tally from the last prizes. The haul from those merchantmen off the Spanish Main, from the sloop taken near the Windward Passage, silver, sugar, cloth, rum, has all been accounted for, traded, or consumed. Now comes the reckoning. Who spent what on supplies, who has what left, and what rules will govern the next division when fortune turns again. He speaks the articles aloud, reminding everyone of promises made. Equal shares for most, larger for captain, quartermaster, gunners, carpenters, compensation for wounds, strict penalties for theft from shipmates. The words are familiar. They've been read before, maybe even signed before with a thumbprint on a scrap of parchment. But words on a page can feel thinner at sea than they did on a sunlit deck in harbour. One man mutters that the captain kept more than his due from a Spanish prize. Another hints that the quartermaster lost a keg of rum somewhere between ship and shore. On some pirate vessels, such accusations have led to formal hearings of a sort, a council called, voices heard, decisions made by majority. Surviving accounts of crews deposing captains like the way Charles Vane was voted out in 1718 after refusing to fight a French warship, replaced by his quartermaster, John Calico Jack Rackham, show that this wasn't just legend. Power among pirates could turn quickly when enough men felt a leader was holding them back or cheating them. You see a flicker of that possibility here. The captain stands slightly apart, arms folded, watching as the quartermaster defends his book. He reminds everyone that he, not the captain, kept the keys to the stores according to their own rules. He points out that his share is written clearly in the articles. Any extra he holds is his own business, won or lost in the same games as everyone else. His voice stays steady, but you can hear the strain underneath. Later, near the galley, you overhear two men talking low. One says that if the captain keeps steering away from the richer shipping lanes for fear of a king's frigate, they might as well have taken the pardon in Nassau and been done with it. The other bristles, saying he didn't come back aboard to crawl to a governor with a piece of paper in his hand. The argument sharpens, not about cards or rum now, but about what kind of risk is worth taking. You know these tensions aren't new. Trial records and depositions from earlier decades mention crews splitting over just such choices, whether to pursue a risky prize, whether to linger in a dangerous harbour, whether to accept a royal pardon, or declare it a trick. Some historians see these debates as proof of a kind of rough democracy, men weighing their options and voting on the shape of their fate. Others note how quickly such discussions could spill into violence, pointing out that the same system which allowed sailors to depose a cowardly captain also made it easy for a loud faction to drag everyone into disasters they hadn't truly chosen. One evening, after a day of sullen work, the simmer boils. A game of dice near the mainmast turns sour when a man accuses his opponent of using a loaded pair. The accused laughs too quickly, tosses the cubes into someone else's lap, insists they're honest. Voices rise. Someone mentions, in a tone that's not quite joking, that the articles allow disputes to be settled ashore with pistols and cutlasses. You've heard of such clauses. Bartholomew Roberts' Code is said to have carried such a rule, and while you've never seen it carried out exactly that way, the idea hangs there, that even among thieves, there are lines that cannot be crossed without blood. The quartermaster arrives before anything worse happens, his presence alone enough to make men step back. He scoops up the dice, weighs them in his hand, rolls them a few times on the deck. Whether they're truly shaved or not, he declares the game over. The stakes forfeit to the common fund. No one is pleased, but the decision stands. For now, you can feel resentment slotting into place like small stones in a wall. In quieter corners, another argument continues. Pardon or no pardon. Those who favour it speak of Woods, Rogers and the King's grace, of men in Nassau who have supposedly hung up their weapons, taken farms or legal commissions, married, settled. Skeptics counter with whispers that some pardoned men were later seized anyway, or driven back to sea by poverty or suspicion. Historians reading the patchy records see cases of both outcomes: former pirates turned respectable, and others back before the bar within a few years. They still debate whether pardons truly offered a path out for most, or just a thin, unreliable escape for a lucky few. You feel that divide in your own chest. Some part of you longs for an anchor that doesn't have to be hauled up again, for a bed that doesn't move, for mornings not measured out by bells and watches. Another part can't quite imagine walking willingly into a governor's courtyard, hat in hand, trusting that the same system that once impressed you, underpaid you, or ignored you will now accept you back with open arms. Those conflicting desires, mirrored in the men around you, pull at the ship's invisible seams. At mess, you notice who sits where. Men who spent their shares fastest huddle together, voices urgent as they talk about needing a big prize soon. Those who hoarded more cling to their caution, arguing for patience, for avoiding well-guarded convoys and heavily armed warships. Some advocate heading toward West African waters, where slaving ships and forts might offer rich targets and terrible risks. Others insist the Caribbean is dangerous enough. The captain listens, says little. The line between careful leadership and cowardice grows thinner with every retold story of captains deposed. Modern scholars will later look at these cracks and see in them either the beginning of the end for pirate communities, or simply the normal strain of any group constantly living at the edge. Some argue that the same structures that let crews share power and plunder also meant they were always poised to break apart, each man ready to vote with his feet or his blade when his interests shifted. Others suggest that the remarkable thing is how often crews held together as long as they did, given the pressures of hunger, law, and fear. Standing by the rail, watching the sunset blur the horizon into copper and grey. You feel the fragility of this so-called brotherhood. On the surface, it looks solid. Shared jokes, shared scars, shared work in storm and battle. Beneath, hairline fractures spread different dreams of the future, different tolerances for risk, different readings of the same worn-out articles pinned to a mast. Between raids, when there is time to think and to talk too much, those cracks widen. Some men gaze toward land and imagine themselves walking away while they still can. Others look only at the sea, seeing one more, ever larger prize just beyond the curve of the world. You stand, as always, somewhere between, feeling the pull of both directions, knowing that whatever choice this crew makes next, pardon, new hunting grounds, or one last wild chase, it will not erase the tensions that have already begun to reshape the lines between friend, rival, and future ghost. Days blur into one another as the ship presses on. But the world around you is not standing still. You feel it in small, unsettling ways at first. A lookout calls sail, and, when you climb to see, the profile on the horizon is not the plump, slow curve of a merchantman, but the stiff, bristling outline of a warship, taller and broader, with more gunports than you care to count. Another day. You glimpse a convoy, a string of traders shepherded by a heavily armed escort. Their course is tight and disciplined, rather than loose and wandering. The sea, once a wide, loosely guarded marketplace, is beginning to feel watched. Rumours carry the shape of this change long before any proclamation reaches your hands. In a smoky tavern in Nassau, before you sailed, someone spoke of Woodes Rogers walking ashore in 1718 with soldiers at his back, a royal commission in his pocket, and the king's pardon in one hand, while the other pointed quietly toward the gallows. You heard how some captain's men you'd only ever known by fierce nicknames accepted that pardon, swore off the black flag, and stayed on as privateers, or even as officials. Others refused, and slipped away into the wider Caribbean, only to find the net following them. Now, weeks later, as your own ship cuts through open water, you hear new names spoken in different tones. Edward Teach Blackbeard no longer a looming figure in nearby inlets, but a story of a fight off the Carolina coast, of a Lieutenant Maynard running his smaller ships close, of smoke and shouting in the shallows, and the famed pirate's bearded face sagging at last in death. Whether every detail you hear is true, the number of wounds, the way his head was supposedly hung from a bowsprit as a warning is hard to know. Contemporary reports and later retellings blur together, but the end itself, somewhere around 1718 at Ocracoke, is not in doubt. Then, in another harbour further south, between barrels and canvas and the quick trade of coin, you catch word that Bartholomew Roberts Black Bart, whose flags and furious discipline have been a constant presence in sailors' gossip, has been killed too. In 1722, off Cape Lopez, on the West African coast, a lucky or unlucky shot from a British warship, they say, took him where he stood on deck, ending one of the most notorious careers of this so-called Golden Age. Some historians point to his death as a kind of marker, a moment when the old era of flamboyant Atlantic piracy began to crumble. Others argue that the decline was more gradual, a long narrowing rather than a single door slammed shut. Either way, news of such endings travels quickly among men whose lives could easily trace the same arc. On your own deck, charts come out more often now. The captain and quartermaster lean over them, fingers tracing not just trade routes but also the known paths of patrols. Governors in Jamaica, Barbados, Virginia, and the Carolinas have been sending letters for years, begging London for more ships, more guns, more authority to try sea robbers quickly. Those requests are finally being answered. Where once a pirate sloop might prowl between islands seeing only plump, underarmed traders, now a tidy frigate might appear in the offing, her officers under orders to make examples whenever possible. You notice changes in your captain's eyes when a sail is spotted. There is more measuring in his gaze now, less instant hunger. A lone merchantman, heavy in the water, still tempts, but a ship that keeps too careful a course, that holds its line when threatened, rather than veering off these raised suspicions. Armed, someone mutters. Too neat for a sugar man. There have always been risks in choosing prey. Now, the balance feels tipped. One misjudgment could mean not just a hard fight, but a noose in some colonial harbour. The men feel it, too. Those who argued loudly for bolder raiding after Nassau now fall silent more often when the lookout sings out. You hear them mutter about convoys forming more regularly, about treasure fleets guarded better on their runs from Spanish America to Europe. Historians looking back will note that improvements in naval organization, convoy systems, and colonial administration all played roles in tightening control over the sea lanes. Some will emphasize economic motives, empires eager to protect lucrative trade more efficiently. Others will see in this moment a broader project of state power extending its reach. Out here, you just know that the spaces where a small ship like yours can lurk unchallenged are shrinking. Safe harbors, too, are changing. Nassau, under Rogers, is no longer the easy refuge it was. Port Royal in Jamaica, long a haunt of buccaneers, before an earthquake shattered much of it in 1692, has been folded more firmly into respectable trade. Governors who once turned a blind eye, happy to see enemy commerce harassed, are now under stricter orders. Those who continue to wink at old habits risk their positions. Letters from the period show colonial officials weighing the cost of angering London against the profit of illicit trade. Over time, the balance tips toward obedience. When your ship does drop anchor now, the welcome feels different. Taverns in out-of-the-way coves still pour rum. Traders still offer powder, shot, and repairs at the right price. But you catch more wary glances, hear more questions about where you've been and what flags you've flown. A few men who once greeted you loudly now stand a little farther back, careful not to be seen too much in your company. There are rewards on offer, after all, for information leading to the capture of notorious captains. Some historians point to such bounties and betrayals as key tools in dismantling pirate networks. Others argue that economic shifts, fewer opportunities, more patrols, crowded harbours did just as much to push men away from outlaw life. On deck one evening, as the sun sinks and paints the sea in streaks of copper and blue, the talk turns again to pardons. A fresh proclamation, someone has heard, extends the king's mercy for a little longer to those willing to come in and swear off piracy. Men argue over the fine print they've never seen. Does it cover every past raid, or only some? Will a man who has fired on a king's ship be forgiven as readily as one who only ever took foreign traders? The truth, buried in legal clauses far away, is not clear to anyone here. Historians later will parse those documents, tracing who accepted and who refused. In this moment, all you have are rumours and your own level of trust in promises printed under a royal seal. The choice, for many, no longer looks like a simple fork between wild freedom and dull respectability. It feels more like a narrowing channel with rocks on either side. Sail on as you are, and you risk capture by increasingly determined patrols, trial in efficient Admiralty courts that no longer need to ship you to London, and a public death meant as a lesson. Turn yourself in, and you may find yourself pressed into the very navy you once fled, or return to a world of low wages and thin chances, where the memory of your black flag days never quite fades. Standing by the rail, you watch a warship's distant sails pass like pale knife blades along the horizon, never turning toward you but never fully out of mind. The black flag, folded away in the captain's chest, feels heavier than cloth now. Raising it again would not just announce your intention to take a prize, it would mark you, unmistakably, as a relic of an era the powers on shore have decided must end. Some scholars question whether Golden Age is even the right term for this time, pointing out that the shine has always looked brightest from a distance, not from the planks where men like you stand. Others note that every age of piracy eventually meets its own tightening net. Between raids, in these quieter days, when you test the wind more carefully and count each unfamiliar sail twice, you sense that you are sailing in the late hours of something. Stories of Blackbeard and Roberts already sound a bit like tales from a slightly larger, wilder time, even though only a few years separate you from their final battles. Harbours grow less welcoming, sea lanes more patrolled, judges more practiced at turning sailors' lives into neat lines of verdict and sentence. And yet, tomorrow, if a fat, obviously unescorted merchantman appears on the horizon, hearts will still quicken, hands will still reach for weapons, and the old hunger will surge up as if none of these new lines on charts and in law books existed. That is the other truth you live with. That even as the net tightens around the black flag, the desire to raise it one more time does not vanish. It lingers in the same hearts that also, late at night, dream uneasily of gallows, pardons, or quiet streets far from the sound of waves. You know, even if you don't say it aloud, that this cannot go on forever. The sea may look endless, the horizon may always offer another line to chase, but men's lives and eras both have their own shorelines, drawn whether they wish them there or not. Between raids, when the sky is clear and no sails speckle the distance, your mind slips forward into futures you would rather not examine too closely. You picture one of them as clearly as if you were there, a chase gone wrong, perhaps, a dull grey day off the American coast or near the Windward Islands, your ship straining every stitch of canvas, while a king's frigate bears down from windward, taller, faster, better armed. You and your shipmates have talked about such scenarios in half-joking tones for years, but the jokes have grown thinner as convoys and patrols multiply. You feel the moment when the warship's first broadside slams into your hull, less like the clean roar of your own guns in battle, more like a hammer blow from something too big to fight. Splinters fly, men shout, but the outcome is already written in the way their rigging holds steady and yours staggers. Some pirate crews in this period chose to fight to the last, blowing themselves up rather than yield. Others, knowing the odds, threw down arms when further resistance meant nothing but more broken bone. You have heard stories of both kinds of endings in taverns from Jamaica to Boston, and historians still debate how often each occurred. In your imagined future, the decision is made for you. A wounded mast, a jammed rudder, a last volley, and then hands raised, weapons skittering across the deck. The next scene unfolds not at sea, but on land, in a place you have never seen but have always half feared. A courtroom near a busy harbour, perhaps in Kingston, Boston, or Cape Coast. You stand with others in worn clothing that still smells faintly of the ship, facing a row of men in wigs and clean linen. A clerk reads out charges: robbery at sea, assault, conspiracy phrases drawn from laws passed in London rooms where no tar ever stains the floorboards. Some of your shipmates try to argue that they were forced into piracy, that they meant to leave, that they never harmed those who surrendered. Such defences do appear in surviving trial records, and sometimes they work. More often, the mere fact of signing articles and taking shares is enough to tip the scales. You see the judge's mouth move, the words to be taken to the place of execution, spilling into the air with the same calm certainty as a weather report. You remember hearing that in Cape Coast. After Bartholomew Roberts fell in 1722, dozens of his captured men were hanged, some along the shore, some displayed as warnings. In Jamaica, Barbados, and along the North American coast, similar scenes played out. Clusters of bodies at the water's edge, carefully positioned where sailors and townsfolk alike could see what became of those who turned their cannons against lawful trade. Not every ending follows that line, of course. You have heard of men who slipped away in confusion, melting into crowds in colonial towns, or who took royal pardons and actually managed to live quietly afterward as innkeepers, small farmers, even pilots on the very routes they once hunted. Historians argue about how many such cases there were and whether they prove that piracy was a phase some could shed, or whether the stigma followed them all their days. But you know that for most who wore the black flag openly, the state preferred endings that could be printed on broadsides and pinned up in taverns as lessons: names, crimes, dates, a neat narrative from ship to scaffold. And then there is another kind of ending, one that does not belong to you alone, but to the whole strange era you've inhabited. Years, then decades, slide by. The ships change shape, convoys grow tighter, patrols more regular, colonial governments more intertwined with the trade they protect, the scattered communities that fed your world, Nassau's loose brotherhood, Port Royal's earlier disorder, half-wild coves where careening parties once gathered are pulled tidily back under official control or simply fade as their usefulness wanes. Your ship, whether captured or wrecked or quietly sold, becomes timber for someone else's plans. Your weapons rust in some forgotten storehouse or are melted down into nails. The black flag itself, once bundled away in a captain's chest, survives only in scraps of cloth or in memory, more often the latter. But the stories do not vanish. In London and Amsterdam and Boston, printers discover that tales of sea rovers sell well. Pamphlets appear, some claiming to be true accounts of notorious pirates' lives, trial speeches, gallows confessions. Later, thicker volumes follow, mixing Admiralty records, tavern gossip, and outright invention into something that reads smoothly and dangerously well. Scholars will later point to one particularly influential book, published in the 1720 seconds, that fixed many of the legends around names like Blackbeard and Roberts, though they will argue endlessly about how much of it can be trusted. Children in inland towns, places that have never smelled tar or heard the sea grow up, mouthing those names with a thrill that has nothing to do with hunger, scourging, or scurvy. As the decades turn to centuries, the rough, complicated men you knew are sanded down into characters. The charming rogue, the cruel captain, the hearty crewman who sings as he swings. The hardship of salted meat and cramped hammocks becomes, at best, a background detail. The quiet regrets whispered on night watches vanish almost entirely. You imagine someone, long after you are gone, walking through a museum where a curved cutlass lies under glass, its edge dulled by time. The placard offers a date range early 18th century and a carefully worded note about piracy in the Atlantic world. Nearby, a faded flag or a chest with worn iron fittings holds visitors' eyes for a moment before they drift on to other curiosities. Outside, a child waves a plastic toy sword, shouting a pirate's catchphrase learned from a stage play or a moving picture, unaware that men once lay awake on real, creaking decks wrestling with choices far heavier than any costume suggests. Some historians, writing thick books in quiet studies, try to peel back the layers of myth. They read court transcripts, sailors' logs, colonial letters, trying to reconstruct something closer to what your days felt like. The smell of pitch, the groan of timbers, the uneasy mix of equality and violence, rebellion and cruelty. They argue with each other over motives, over whether pirates were rebels, criminals, or something uncomfortably in between. Others focus less on individuals and more on systems, seeing in your life one expression of a larger, restless Atlantic world driven by empire, slavery, and profit. For you, none of those interpretations are available. You live your whole story in the narrow band between deck and sky, between plunder and port, between laughter over cards and the quiet weight that settled on your chest when you thought about what might wait in a courtroom or in a village that still doesn't know what you became. Somewhere far in the future, someone lies in bed, listening to a soft voice talk about pirates, not the polished ones of costume and song, but the ones who mended sails, scraped hulls, gambled away shares, drank rough rum, and stared at the stars, wondering whether they had chosen their fate or simply floated into it on tides they never fully saw. That person is safe, wrapped in their own blanket, the sea held at a comfortable distance by the walls of their room and the thin thread of story. They will sleep and wake, perhaps with a lingering image of lantern light on a wet deck, or the murmur of men sharing regrets they'll never write down. And you, as you stand at the rail in your mind's last clear picture, watching a horizon that once promised everything and now mostly offers reflection, feel your world sliding slowly from fact into memory, from lived days into legend. The cannons fall silent. The cards are stacked away. The black flag, so sharp once in the wind, becomes a shadow in someone else's imagination. What remains, after the last raid, is not just gallows or pardons, but the way your life thins and spreads into ink, song, and quiet bedtime tales that turn rough planks and hard choices into something gentle enough to dream on. The ship rocks you one last time, a slow, old motion, as if even the sea is ready to let this chapter rest. Now, as the scenes of raids and trials and storm-tossed nights drift further away, the sounds around you soften. Cannon fire drops first to a distant echo, then to nothing at all. The creak of rigging fades into the quieter hush of leaves outside a window, or the faint hum of a city far away. Lanterns that once swung over crowded decks burn lower in your mind's eye, their light shrinking to small, steady circles on worn planks before winking out one by one. Harbours empty themselves. The raucous taverns of Nassau and Port Royal grow still, chairs turned upside down on tables, their doorways dark. The old forts on the hills stand quiet, cannons rusted, their stone warmed only by sunlight and the occasional seabird's shadow. Along quiet riverbanks and coastlines, the gibbets and gallows that once held grim warnings are gone, their timbers rotted away, the ground beneath them folded back into ordinary earth. What was once a stage for punishment is now just part of the landscape: grass, sand, and sky. In the present, far from those days, library shelves rest in the dark, heavy books closed, the dust on their spines undisturbed. Somewhere, a museum guard locks the doors and walks away, leaving glass cases and old cutlasses to sleep in the dim. Streets outside grow quieter as shops close. Lights blink out in apartment windows, and the world steps gently into its own night watch. Trains slow, last trams hum home. Carriages and cars alike find places to rest. You, listening here, are no longer on that crowded deck at all. You are in your own bed, with your own walls around you, the dangers of the 18th century sea held safely at a distance by time. The storms you heard about have already blown themselves out long ago. The judges have spoken, the pardons have been sealed, the taverns have emptied, and the ships you followed have long since turned to wood dust and memory. Their troubles belong firmly to the past now, like old waves that have rolled up on a shore and gone silent. All that remains for you is the gentle sway of your own breath, in and out, like a calm tide against a quiet harbour. The rough voices of pirates fade into a softer murmur, more like distant surf than shouted orders. The black flag folds itself away, and above you, not a single threatening sail mars the sky, only the deep, steady dark, and whatever peaceful shapes your mind wants to place among the stars. You are safe here, wrapped in your own blankets, while centuries settle into silence, and as history closes its heavy books for the night, the quiet stars of another age watch over your dreams.